The Western Roman Empire did not collapse in a single dramatic instant. It cracked, trembled, and staggered long before it finally fell. In the golden light of its peak, Rome had seemed indestructible, its legions marching across continents, its marble forums echoing with debate, its markets humming with goods from 3 continents. But beneath that grandeur, the weight of empire was taking its toll. By the 3rd century, Rome was already battling invisible enemies. The economy began to buckle under the strain of overexpansion. Endless borders meant endless armies, and soldiers demanded pay. To meet the costs, emperors debased the currency, mixing less silver into each coin, and inflation ran wild. A loaf of bread that once cost a single denarius suddenly cost hundreds. The poor grew desperate, the rich withdrew to countryside villas, and the once bustling cities began to empty out. Meanwhile, disease moved faster than armies. The Antonine Plague and the later plague of Cyprian tore through Rome like wildfire. With no understanding of germs, Romans turned to superstition or sacrifice. Entire legions were decimated not by enemies, but by invisible sickness. Fields were left unharvested, towns unguarded, and economies paralyzed. The government tried to adapt, but found itself drowning in bureaucracy and corruption. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed, some ruling for months, others for days. Between 235 and 284 CE alone, Rome saw over 24 emperors, many assassinated by their own guards. The famed Praetorian Guard, once elite protectors of the emperor, had become kingmakers for hire, auctioning off power to the highest bidder. Stability became a memory. Then came Diocletian. In the late 3rd century, this stern reformer tried to halt the collapse by reshaping the empire itself. He divided it into East and West, thinking 2 emperors would govern better than one. He added layers of administration and enforced harsh economic rules, price controls, hereditary jobs, and tighter tax systems. For a while it worked. The bleeding slowed, if not stopped. But these fixes came at a cost. The rigid tax system strangled farmers and merchants alike. Entire villages fled into forests to avoid the burden. Many gave up freedom for protection, surrendering land to large landowners who offered security in return for labor, a shadow of what would later become feudalism. Social mobility vanished. Sons were chained to the trade of their fathers. A blacksmith's child would be a blacksmith, a soldier's child a soldier. The once vibrant Roman citizen now trudged through life under layers of law, debt, and fear. Pride in the Republic had long vanished, replaced by loyalty to local warlords or desperate clinging to church and family. Religion, too, was shifting. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, had risen. Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century gave it imperial favor. Pagan temples were slowly shuttered, bishops gained political clout, and faith offered a kind of emotional refuge from the chaos. But it also fractured the empire spiritually. Old traditions clashed with new ones, and the unity that had once bound Roman identity began to fray. As the West strained under these pressures, the eastern half of the empire, centered in Constantinople, began to thrive. Better defended, wealthier, and more urban, the East became the favorite child of imperial attention. The West was increasingly treated like an aging relative, too expensive to care for, too troublesome to ignore. By the late 4th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a shell of its former self. Its armies were stretched thin, its coffers nearly empty, its people restless. And beyond the northern borders storm clouds gathered. The barbarian tribes, once scattered and tribal, were on the move. Some came fleeing war. Others came seeking opportunity. But most came because Rome, for all its rot, still looked like paradise. And so, while Roman senators debated tax reform and bishops argued over doctrine, the edges of the empire trembled. The center, too absorbed in its own survival, didn't yet realize that the barbarians weren't just knocking at the gates. They were already inside. The barbarians didn't come all at once, nor did they all come with bloodlust in their eyes. Many came hungry, displaced, and desperate. Among them were the Visigoths, a branch of the larger Gothic peoples, who had been living along the Roman frontier for generations. Some had fought for Rome, learned Latin, and traded in Roman markets. But in 376 CE, a wave of terror swept through the Gothic homelands as the Huns, fierce horsemen from the east, thundered across the steppes, leaving fire and fear in their wake. The Visigoths had no choice but to flee. They reached the Danube River, the northern border of the Roman Empire, and begged for refuge. They weren't seeking conquest, they were seeking safety. Emperor Valens, ruling the Eastern Roman Empire, granted them permission to cross. But the welcome turned sour. Corrupt Roman officials extorted the refugees, trading food for slaves, and starving entire communities. Anger brewed. In 378 CE, it boiled over at the Battle of Adrianople. The Visigoths, now armed and furious, clashed with Roman legions in one of the most humiliating defeats in imperial history. Emperor Valens himself died in the battle, his body never recovered. The shockwave rippled through the empire. For the first time, Rome had lost a major battle inside its own territory to a group it had let in. Yet even then, Rome didn't fall. It absorbed the blow and stumbled on. More tribes were allowed to settle within imperial lands under negotiated treaties, becoming, foederati, allies tasked with defending Roman soil. It was a short-term fix with long-term consequences. These groups maintained their own leaders, spoke their own languages, and cared little for Roman law. They were within the empire, but not truly of it. Over time, this patchwork of shifting alliances created deep fractures in the Roman military. More and more, Rome relied on barbarian soldiers to fight its wars. Whole units were composed of Goths, Franks, or Vandals. The Roman legions of old, disciplined, uniform, loyal, had become a mosaic of mercenaries. And loyalties shifted easily. When Roman pay ran dry, soldiers turned to local generals or warlords who could feed them. One of the most prominent figures to emerge from this new order was Alaric, a Visigothic chieftain and former Roman military commander. Charismatic and cunning, he knew how to play Roman politics, but he also carried deep grievances. He'd fought for Rome, expected reward, and been denied. So, in 401 CE, he marched his people into Italy, not as wild invaders, but as warriors demanding recognition and land. Rome responded as it always had, with delay, negotiation, and half-hearted military resistance. The emperor at the time, Honorius, was more concerned with court intrigue in the city of Ravenna than the fate of the Eternal City itself. His advisors bickered, his generals defected, and his enemies closed in. Alaric, sensing weakness, kept pressing forward. But Alaric didn't want to destroy Rome. He wanted a place within it. He offered peace in exchange for a permanent home for his people. Again and again, Rome stalled. Talks broke down. Promises were made and broken. And finally, after years of insult and evasion, Alaric decided to send a message. In 410 CE, he did what no one had done in 800 years, he sacked the city of Rome. The event was brief, 3 days of controlled looting, not a wanton massacre. Churches were largely spared. Fires were few. Alaric had given strict orders. But the psychological damage was immense. The idea of Rome, eternal, invincible, divine, was shattered. People across the empire wept, prayed, and panicked. St. Jerome wrote that he could not eat or sleep. Refugees poured out of Italy. The very soul of the West trembled. Alaric soon died, leaving his people adrift once more. But the spell had been broken. The walls of Rome had been breached. The world had seen that the empire was not immortal. Other tribes took notice. The Vandals, fierce warriors from North Africa, began eyeing the Mediterranean. The Huns, now united under the fearsome Attila, loomed like a storm cloud. The Burgundians, Franks and Saxons carved out their own corners of what had once been Roman land. Like scavengers around a wounded beast, they saw opportunity. Rome, meanwhile, was increasingly unable to respond. The West had no real standing army. Its bureaucracy was bloated and slow. Its emperors mere figureheads. The Eastern Empire watched from afar, occasionally sending aid, often just sending thoughts and prayers. What made it all the more tragic was that many of these so-called barbarians didn't even hate Rome. They admired its roads, its laws, its religion. They wanted a piece of it, not its ashes, but its legacy. But Rome, clinging to its pride and bureaucracy, failed to bring them in as partners. And so, the gates remained closed, until they were kicked open. The rot in the Western Roman Empire wasn't just caused by outside pressure, it was internal decay that truly hollowed it out. Long before the final collapse, Rome had become a battlefield of ambition, greed, and betrayal. While emperors changed like seasons, the real power often shifted behind the scenes, among generals, court officials, and regional governors who all saw the empire not as a sacred trust, but a prize to be seized. One of the most illustrative figures of this era was Stilicho, a Roman general of Vandal descent who rose to command the Western armies in the early 5th century. Loyal, skilled, and fiercely pragmatic, Stilicho managed to hold the empire together during a time when it could have fallen apart even sooner. But his enemies at court feared his influence. Accusations of treason were whispered, and in 408 CE, Emperor Honorius, always easily manipulated, ordered Stilicho's execution. With him gone, one of the last real defenders of Rome's stability vanished. This was a pattern that repeated over and over. Talented leaders were removed not for failure, but for success that made others nervous. Civil wars flared like brush fires across the empire. Usurpers claimed thrones in Gaul, Britain, and Africa. Each one distracted resources and attention from the growing external threats, weakening the whole system further. Meanwhile, the empire's very concept of unity had begun to unravel. The division between East and West, first meant as a strategy to improve governance, became a political wall. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, grew wealthier and more secure. They viewed the crumbling West as a liability, offering aid only when it served their own interests. Eastern emperors were reluctant to send troops or funds unless it directly protected their sphere. This left the Western Empire isolated, a drifting ship with a leaking hull. Amidst this fragmentation, the Roman military evolved, or rather devolved, into something almost unrecognizable. Instead of disciplined citizen soldiers, the army relied heavily on federated barbarian forces and personal militias. Generals raised troops loyal only to themselves. Soldiers expected land or loot instead of salary. Loyalty to the empire faded. It became every man for himself. Even more destabilizing was the abandonment of old infrastructure. Roads once patrolled and maintained by imperial engineers fell into disrepair. Aqueducts cracked, and the great bathhouses went dry. Urban centers shrank. Some cities were simply abandoned as residents fled to the countryside in search of food and safety. Trade routes collapsed, not because they were attacked, but because the empire could no longer secure them. With fewer markets, currency devalued even more. Barter replaced coin. Commerce shriveled. Culture, too, shifted. Latin was still spoken, but regional dialects began to diverge. Education, once a hallmark of Roman identity, became a luxury. Schools closed. Libraries decayed. The grand philosophical debates of Cicero and Seneca were replaced by more practical concerns: how to defend a village, how to store food, how to stay alive. Even religion, Rome's newest pillar, couldn't mend the breaks. The church had become powerful, with bishops often more respected than governors. But this led to conflict, not unity. Different sects argued over the nature of Christ, the divinity of Mary, the authority of the Pope. The Council of Chalcedon and others tried to impose clarity, but instead fueled more division. In some cases, cities were torn apart by theological disagreements as fiercely as by enemy swords. Ordinary Romans felt the collapse in ways that rarely made the history books. A farmer in Gaul might wake to find his land claimed by a local warlord. A merchant in Hispania might discover that his coins were worthless in the next province. A mother in northern Italy might send her son to join the army, not out of duty, but as the only way to feed him. The trust in Rome had eroded. The idea that the empire was a force for order, prosperity, and peace no longer matched reality. People began to look for protection elsewhere: local landlords, strongmen, bishops. The seeds of medieval feudalism were being planted in the cracks of Roman authority. And yet, despite all of this, the empire still claimed to be what it had always been. Emperors were crowned with pomp and ceremony. Edicts were issued in grand language. Statues were built. The rituals of empire continued, even as the substance faded. It was like watching a ghost wear the skin of a once great king. As the Western Roman Empire staggered through the first half of the 5th century, the sense of identity it had fostered for centuries, Pax Romana, Roman citizenship, the rule of law, faded into memory. Power lay not in titles but in swords. And the swords were in the hands of men who no longer spoke Latin, no longer bowed to Rome, and no longer waited for imperial permission. The fall wasn't sudden. It was a slow, grinding unraveling. But by now, the threads had frayed to the point of snapping. It was August of 410 CE, and the unimaginable had happened: Rome had fallen. Not in the apocalyptic, end of a sense, but in a moment that shattered illusions and echoed like thunder across the known world. For 3 days, the Visigoths, under Alaric, moved through the Eternal City, looting treasures, opening gates to prisoners, and stripping away the last vestiges of Roman invulnerability. And yet, despite the chaos, Rome didn't burn to the ground. The city survived, scarred but standing. Churches were largely respected, thanks to Alaric's Christian faith. But the symbolism of the sack, of foreign boots echoing down Roman streets, of noble families reduced to refugees, of gold and relics carted off into the night, cut deeper than any fire ever could. This was the first sack of Rome in over 800 years. To the Roman psyche, it was as if Olympus itself had crumbled. From Gaul to Syria, people whispered the same stunned question: if Rome could fall, what hope did anyone else have? In the aftermath, Alaric didn't linger. He led his people south, hoping to sail them to North Africa to find a new homeland. Fate, however, had other plans. Alaric died soon after, reportedly buried beneath a riverbed in a secret ceremony, his grave hidden by diverting the stream and then killing the laborers who made it. Whether legend or truth, his death marked the end of a certain era. But his people, and others, kept marching. Following the Visigoths, more tribes surged westward. The Vandals, having crossed the Rhine during the chaotic New Year's Eve of 406 CE, eventually carved a path down through Spain into North Africa. Led by Genseric, they seized Carthage in 439 CE, Rome's old rival and one of its richest provinces. With control of the grain supply and a naval fleet, the Vandals became not just a land threat, but a maritime one. Rome was no longer just under pressure, it was bleeding resources. North Africa had been the empire's breadbasket. Losing it meant famine and inflation. The empire's internal systems, already weakened, now teetered. Supplies to the army dwindled. Urban unrest spiked. Once proud cities became islands of fear. Then, in 455 CE, came the second sack of Rome, this time by the Vandals. Unlike Alaric's measured raid, this one was harsher. The city was stripped of its treasures. Statues were pulled down. Churches looted. Even the Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her daughters were taken captive. The term, vandalism, owes its origin to this moment, not because the Vandals were uniquely cruel, but because the optics were devastating. The emperors during this time became shadows, often children, frequently puppets. They were placed on the throne by military strongmen like Ricimer, a half-Swabi, half-Roman general who wielded real power from behind the curtain. Emperors came and went with dizzying speed, some reigning mere months. There was no stable hand at the wheel. And then there were the Huns. For years, the Huns had terrified the edges of the empire, their origin mysterious, their tactics brutal. But in the 440s, under Attila, they became an existential threat. Dubbed the Scourge of God, Attila ravaged the Balkans and marched into Gaul. In 451 CE, he was met at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, a fierce, sprawling conflict where Roman legions, Visigothic allies, and assorted forces barely held the line. Attila would later turn toward Italy, devastating cities in the north. Legend says he was only turned away from sacking Rome by a diplomatic mission led by Pope Leo I, whose presence, and perhaps a timely outbreak of disease, convinced Attila to retreat. The Pope returned hailed as a savior, but even he knew how fragile peace had become. By the 460s, what remained of the Western Roman Empire was a collection of nominal provinces, ruled in name by emperors but in practice by warlords, bishops, and barbarian generals. The cities of Gaul increasingly looked to local leaders for protection. Britain had been abandoned entirely. Hispania was fractured. Italy itself was a battleground. In 472 CE, Rome was once again besieged, this time by Ricimer himself, who had fallen out with yet another puppet emperor. The city, once the beating heart of the known world, had become a pawn in petty struggles, its glory buried beneath rubble and politics. The final blow came not in the form of fire or blood, but bureaucracy. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus. No great battle. No heroic last stand. Just a quiet transition, as the imperial regalia were sent east to Constantinople, and Odoacer declared himself ruler of Italy under the nominal authority of the Eastern Emperor. Rome, in the west, was done. But the world didn't end. Markets still opened. Children still played in crumbling forums. The church grew stronger. New kingdoms rose from the empire's corpse. The sack of Rome may have shattered an illusion, but life, remarkably, continued. By the late 470s, the Western Roman Empire had shrunk to a memory dressed in ceremony. The senators still wore their purple-trimmed togas, and the imperial seal was pressed onto official documents, but the empire itself was hollow. Behind the marble facades, real power had shifted entirely into the hands of foreign generals, most of them not Roman at all. Enter Orestes, a Roman aristocrat and former secretary to Attila the Hun. In 475 CE, he placed his own teenage son, Romulus Augustulus, on the imperial throne in Ravenna. The name sounded like a Roman greatest hits: Romulus, founder of Rome, Augustus, its first emperor, but the boy was a figurehead, nothing more. He ruled for less than a year. When Orestes refused to grant land in Italy to his Germanic mercenaries, their commander Odoacer revolted. He defeated Orestes, spared young Romulus, and sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple cloak, the golden scepter, to Constantinople with a polite note: there was no longer need for two emperors. Let the East reign alone. This quiet coup in 476 CE is often marked as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But to many who lived through it, the world didn't change overnight. There were no burning cities, no doomsday proclamations. In fact, many were relieved. The endless power struggles, civil wars, and corrupt rulers had worn people down. At least Odoacer brought a semblance of stability. He styled himself as the King of Italy, ruling with the consent of the Eastern Emperor Zeno. Under Odoacer, Roman laws were still enforced. The Senate still convened. Taxes were collected, roads repaired, and grain distributed. The ghost of Rome lingered in its institutions, even if the empire no longer stood. But make no mistake, this was no Roman revival. The Western Empire as a unifying force was gone. In its place were a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, each with their own customs and power bases. The Ostrogoths would soon replace Odoacer. In Gaul, the Franks, under Clovis, consolidated their power. In Hispania, the Visigoths carved out a realm. Even in North Africa, the Vandals continued to thrive, though their days were numbered. And the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium, watched it all unfold from afar. They accepted Odoacer's letter, mostly because they had no real choice. The West had become ungovernable, and Constantinople had its own problems, religious disputes, Persian threats, and later, Arab expansion. Still, they considered themselves the true heirs of Rome and kept the imperial torch burning for nearly another 1,000 years. The cultural shift was profound. Without the unifying hand of Roman governance, Latin began to fragment into early forms of the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian. Architecture turned more localized and fortified. Instead of bathhouses and theaters, new settlements prioritized walls and watchtowers. Trade shrank, literacy declined, and craftsmanship became focused more on utility than beauty. Christianity filled the void. The Church became the only institution to transcend the collapse. Bishops often acted as governors, diplomats, even military leaders. The Pope, once merely the Bishop of Rome, grew in authority and influence. As Roman civic identity faded, Christian identity surged. Rome had fallen, but the idea of Christendom was just beginning. Even so, memories of Rome lingered. Medieval kings styled themselves emperors, in imitation. Charlemagne, centuries later, would be crowned Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans, by the Pope, reviving the title even if the world had changed beyond recognition. To wield Rome's legacy was to claim a certain legitimacy, a link to something ancient and grand. Ordinary people adjusted in quiet ways. A farmer in Italy might still call himself Roman, even as his overlords spoke Gothic. A priest in Gaul copied Latin texts in fading ink, preserving snippets of Cicero and Virgil. A potter in North Africa made amphorae not for Roman markets, but for local barter. Life went on, reoriented but unbroken. Still, the decline left scars. The safety and stability once guaranteed by Roman law were gone. Raiders could now cross borders with impunity. Pirates returned to the Mediterranean. Roads were no longer policed. For those who remembered better times, if any still lived, it must have felt like living among the ruins of giants. And yet, these ruins also inspired. The remnants of aqueducts, colosseums, and temples whispered of a time when humanity had reached for greatness. That whisper would echo into the Renaissance, when artists and scholars dug through the rubble not just for marble, but for meaning. By the close of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become something else entirely, not a government, but a myth, a memory, a source of pride and mystery. Its fall wasn't the end of civilization. It was the beginning of a new chapter, messier, darker, but full of new beginnings. In the centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, no trumpets sounded to declare a new age. There were no banners that read, "Now entering the Middle Ages." Instead, the world simply shifted, slowly, unevenly, and profoundly. What had once been a vast, interconnected empire became a patchwork of local powers, emerging cultures, and stubborn traditions, all layered over the fading imprint of Rome. For the average person, life didn't come to a dramatic halt after 476 CE. A farmer still rose with the sun. A potter still shaped clay. A mother still taught her children to pray. But their world was different. The old Roman roads were still there, though overgrown. The language on official tablets was still Latin, though fewer could read it. And in many places, Roman law still lingered, though justice now came from a local bishop or a tribal chief. The Church had become the spine of Western society. As civil institutions withered, religious ones flourished. Monasteries served as schools, hospitals, and storehouses of knowledge. Monks copied texts by candlelight, scrolls of Aristotle, Caesar, early Christian theology, preserving them through centuries of chaos. Latin, though evolving, remained the language of the Church, giving it immense influence over the emerging medieval world. The legacy of Rome survived in ways both subtle and profound. In architecture, the Roman arch and dome were reborn in medieval cathedrals. In law, fragments of Roman principles shaped the codes of emerging European kingdoms. In identity, rulers from Charlemagne to the Holy Roman Emperors claimed the mantle of Rome to legitimize their rule, even if the empire they evoked had long turned to dust. Still, the changes were undeniable. The great cities of the Western Empire shrank. Some, like Londinium, modern London, were abandoned for generations. Others became little more than fortified towns, built within the walls of their former grandeur. The sweeping trade networks that once moved goods from Egypt to Britannia collapsed. Commerce became local, and coins gave way to bartered goods. Wealth was measured in land and livestock, not denarii. New powers emerged from the ashes. The Franks in Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, the Lombards in Italy, each forged their own kingdoms, each blending Roman customs with their own tribal laws. These were not mere replacements for Rome, but something new, the foundations of modern Europe. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman Empire lived on, in name, power, and ambition. The Byzantines, as modern historians call them, but who called themselves simply Romans, held fast in Constantinople. Their capital gleamed with marble and mosaics, their armies defended Anatolia and the Balkans, and their emperors kept the dream of Rome alive long after the West had let it go. Justinian I would later attempt to reconquer the western provinces in the 6th century, launching campaigns into North Africa and Italy. For a time, it seemed Rome might rise again. But it never truly did, at least, not in the same way. What had been lost in unity was gained in diversity. The world of the early medieval West became a mosaic of languages, customs, and faiths, slowly finding its footing in a new age. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single tragedy, but a series of transformations. Yes, it involved war, betrayal, famine, and fear. But it also involved adaptation, survival, and reinvention. The people of late antiquity didn't just watch Rome fall, they helped build what came next. Even today, echoes of Rome are everywhere. In the architecture of Washington, D.C., in the civil laws of Europe, in the Latin roots of everyday words, in the calendar, the alphabet, even the idea of a senate. Rome, in many ways, never ended. It simply became part of the bones of Western civilization. So what really happened during the fall of the Western Roman Empire? It didn't die, it evolved. It shrank, yes. It fractured, absolutely. But in breaking, it scattered seeds across the world, ideas about citizenship, justice, engineering, and empire. Those seeds would lie dormant for a time, only to bloom again in different forms. The image of armored legions, of emperors in purple robes, of aqueducts and forums, that Rome is gone. But the spirit of Rome, the impact of its rise and fall, still shapes the world we live in. The collapse was not just an end. It was a turning point. And sometimes, when you walk among ruins or hear the echo of Latin in a courtroom, you can still hear it, the whisper of an empire that changed the world.